Welcome back to Game Theory Today. I'm Eric Garland. YouTube is telling me that many of my viewers are watching because they are looking up videos about intelligence analysis, tradecraft, and how to work as an intelligence analyst in the field. That is very dorky, and I like it a lot. If that is why you're watching, you're in luck today, because this video is about analytic tradecraft, integrity, and professional standards. And while nerdy, those are important because those standards were allegedly violated so badly that it may rise to the level of criminal charges. Grand juries are open against CIA Director John Brennan, at the very least for his apparent obvious lie under oath that the CIA had nothing to do with the Steele dossier, didn't include it in any major reports, when in fact it had. The DOJ is reportedly investigating a grand conspiracy to create false intelligence connecting Trump and Putin, and the Steele dossier was at the center of that. Now, if you follow my work, you know I've been on this topic for around 9 years, and I single-handedly brought Russia's attacks to the public's attention on Twitter in December 2016 after Trump won with my game theory thread. But I was careful about what I said, that Russia was attacking democracy and that foreign and domestic agents were all over America, concluding that the Trump years were about to be very rough. And I stand by all of that, as all of that came to pass. But now we have increasing evidence that certain leaders of the intelligence community had a deleterious effect on our national discussion about that attack. The CIA entered the discussion about America's 2016 election, and through media leaks and the creation of certain reports to the public, gave Americans a false impression of the newly elected president's relationship to the Russian Federation. The CIA itself has now conducted a tradecraft review of how a controversial report on Trump and Russia was produced, and it looks increasingly clear that a few agency heads betrayed the analytic standards of their agencies in order to affect American political debate. It's looking like it comes down to John Brennan versus the CIA. Let's go. Reading the CIA Tradecraft review, I've identified about 10 ways that John Brennan appears to have single-handedly overridden the practices of the CIA and the rest of the intelligence community. It's not that the CIA attacked America's 2016 election as a whole, it's that former CIA Director John Brennan and former Director of National Intelligence General Jim Clapper used the CIA to achieve the goal of harming President Trump based on fraudulent intelligence. We're going to go over the 2016 intelligence community assessment in the same spirit that this channel revisited the Iraq War intelligence, which is by some of the same people behind the Iraq War intelligence, and which leads, sadly, to the same set of conclusions about their analytical rigor and what their intentions were. It's not very good. I have a bit of personal animus here. Without the late 2016 intelligence community assessment and the testimony in public from agency heads, guys like me working in the open source would never have reached the same conclusions about Trump and Russia that we did. I had one set when I was writing my game theory thread, December 11th, 2016, and when those guys came out in public and said, we have high confidence, that changed the way guys like me thought about it. So I want this unpacked all the way. You know, it's like when we heard that Trump advisor Carter Page had a FISA warrant on him for his work in Russia. During the campaign, this guy, Carter Page, was going to Russia, and to get a FISA warrant thrown on you by the DOJ and by the intelligence community, that says that you're working for another government. You're certainly not one of ours, and we want to know exactly what you're up to. Well, guys like me, when we heard about that FISA, we assumed there must be something to it when you go to apply to the FISC, the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court, which was, I believe, overseen by Judge Boasberg, whose name pops up a lot these days. We assumed it had to be something other than just that stupid Steele dossier everyone was gossiping about. But no, it appears now that that's all there was to get a very important FISA warrant on this guy. And when the CIA came out and said that it had high confidence in Putin preferring Trump, it couldn't just be that this stupid Steele dossier was behind that assessment. By definition of what high confidence means, it had to be more than that. But now we have a declassified CIA note about the tradecraft behind the 2016 ICA, and the Central Intelligence Agency is now saying that there were significant departures from its normal practices at the behest of former Director Brennan, and the Steele dossier was playing a starring role yet again. So in this video, I'm going to take you through the offending 2016 ICA, which I'm sure none of you have read, and the CIA's June 2025 Tradecraft Review. If you've ever had an opinion about Trump and or Russia, this nerdy stuff is worth your time because the spies in question got involved in our national discussion. They got involved in at least one impeachment, and then they keep coming out for further discussions about things like Hunter Biden's laptop being Russian disinformation. So we need to examine their conduct as intelligence professionals. And I'm afraid it doesn't look very good for former Director Brennan or General Clapper, and America may need to resort to criminal prosecution to clean this kind of thing up. Okay, let's get into the nitty-gritty, folks. If we're going to understand the CIA Tradecraft Review, i.e. what was wrong, we got to look at the document that got produced just prior to Trump taking office, and that was the Intelligence Community Assessment entitled Assessing Russian Activities and Intentions in Recent U.S. Elections. The publication date for this was January 6th, 2017. Just to review super quick, they had an assessment of what Russia was up to up until about December 8th. On December 9th, 2016, President Obama calls all the spooks together and says, clear this stuff up for me, do a final report. They decide they're going to have this thing out before Donald Trump takes office, and around the 10th of January, they present this under oath to the American people, and their conclusions were pretty intense, that Trump was preferred by Vladimir Putin, and Putin took actions potentially to make him president. So let's look at exactly what they said so we can go back and see what the CIA said about their own performance about it some years later. Scope and sourcing. Information available as of 29 December 2016 was used in the preparation of this product, so it's a snapshot in time. This report includes an analytic assessment drafted and coordinated among three agencies, the CIA, FBI, and the National Security Agency, the NSA. It draws on intelligence information collected and disseminated by those three agencies. It covers the motivation and scope of Moscow's intentions regarding U.S. elections and Moscow's use of cyber tools and media campaigns to influence public opinion. When we use the term we, it refers to an assessment by all three agencies. This report is a declassified version of a highly classified assessment. The document's conclusions are identical to the highly classified assessment, but it doesn't give the full supporting information. So they're saying even if you had an ultra high security clearance, it would say the same stuff. They make clear that they do not analyze US political processes. They're just looking at what the Russians did. And kind of worrisome here, new information continues to emerge, providing increased insight into Russian activities. Okay. Some of our judgments about Kremlin preferences and intent are drawn from the behavior of Kremlin-loyal political figures, state media, and pro-Kremlin social media actors, all of whom the Kremlin either directly uses to convey messages or who are answerable to the Kremlin. Man, that's pretty complicated. You kind of expect them to go, hey, we have an audio recording of Vladimir Putin saying, I don't like Clinton. I can't wait until my friend Donald Trump takes office, but he never does. And almost immediately we're hearing about Moscow's intentions or Vladimir Putin's aspirations, but we immediately back off and go, a lot of this is from Kremlin's social media actors. That's a far cry from the president of the country. Moving on. Key judgments, and they lead super hard here. We assess Russian President Vladimir Putin ordered an influence campaign in 2016 aimed at the US presidential election. Russia's goals were to undermine public faith in the U.S. democratic process, denigrate Secretary Clinton, harm her electability, and her potential presidency. Wow, that sounds a lot like my game theory thread. I'm excited so far. Keep going. We further assess Putin and the Russian government developed a clear preference for President-elect Trump, and we have high confidence in these judgments. Ooh, that's different than how they were talking a few weeks ago. Let's see what they got. We also assess Putin and the Russian government aspired to help President-elect Trump's election chances when possible by discrediting Clinton and publicly contrasting her unfavorably to him. And that further information has come to light since Election Day that when combined with Russian behavior since November 2016, which is a few weeks ago, this increases our confidence in our assessments of Russian motivations and goals. Well, it looks like that evidence was, that information was the Steele dossier and not much else. But they say they assess with high confidence that Russian military was behind WikiLeaks, which some of us kind of knew. Okay, that's pretty important. Let's see what they have to back it up. Now, again, they're saying we think Trump was preferred by Putin and Putin took actions to help his buddy Donald Trump, which the entire intelligence community did not say that a few weeks before. Let's see what else they have in there, though. Russia's influence campaign targeting the 2016 US presidential election. We also assess Putin and the Russian government aspired to help President-elect Trump's chances when possible by discrediting Secretary Clinton. Okay? We assess that Putin, his advisors, and the Russian government developed a clear preference for Trump over Clinton. That Putin publicly indicated a preference for President-elect Trump's stated policy to work with Russia. And then pro-Kremlin figures spoke highly about what they saw as his right. Well, pro-Kremlin figures is different than Putin and the government. So a bit of a switcheroo already there in the same sentence, that Putin wanted one thing, then people who we assume are like Putin wanted the same thing. Not clear there. Putin has had many positive experiences working with Silvio Berlusconi and Schrader from Germany. Okay, that really doesn't have anything to do with what Putin did in our election, though. Here, Putin, Russian officials, and other pro-Kremlin pundits stopped publicly criticizing the U.S. election process as unfair almost immediately after the election because Moscow probably assessed it would be counterproductive. They're backing off some of their confidence here. They don't have the same tone now, do they? Kind of reminds one of the Iraq War, I think, where they're like, Saddam Hussein, incredible weapons, amazing weapons. We assess that he continues to want weapons. These are different things. Then you have some generalized statements here. Influence effort was the boldest yet in the U.S. Elections operation signals new normal in Russian influence efforts. Reviewing the 2016 intelligence community assessment, it's not as strong as you remember on the spooks coming out and saying Putin wanted Trump. They actually had vanishingly little in their assessment that said Putin made specific statements about how he wanted Trump and not Clinton, that he was taking these actions about WikiLeaks for his friend Trump, that he was doing all these things to make sure Trump became president. In fact, it sounded like he didn't actually have a preference for which candidate won, and in true KGB fashion, they had a plan for either outcome because their goal is not anything specific. Their goal is just damaging democracy and America in particular, and they have to work with whichever political party wins. So they hate us all equally. So now we go back to the future. June 26th, 2025. Brand new president, guy named Donald Trump. Brand new CIA Director John Ratcliffe. And Ratcliffe orders that the Deputy Director for Analysis for the whole CIA do a review of how that document got put together, and particularly how the CIA took the lead on it. How did it turn out? Not very good. Turns out much of how that document was produced, not just its conclusions, but how it was produced, was bad. It was just a heap of problems, and they go into it in great detail, which is why we're looking at this. It's very, very interesting to me. So the review focused particular attention on the ICA's most debated judgment, that Russian President Vladimir Putin, quote, aspired to help then candidate Donald Trump win the election. Drawing on CIA materials provided to congressional oversight investigations, the CIA Director of Analysis examined whether any procedural anomalies or tradecraft weaknesses may have affected the soundness and objectivity of this key judgment and the overall assessment. An assessment of the origins and context. To understand the procedural and tradecraft issues identified in this review, it is essential to examine the politically charged environment and unique circumstances that led to the ICA's development in late 2016. I'll say we've never had an American president order that the spooks produce a report that can go to the public about which country might have put a sleeper agent in the White House. It's a hell of a thing, right? During this period, conflicting public and private statements by intelligence community officials about Russia's role in the US presidential election created confusion about the IC's actual assessment. These contradictory messages prompted President Obama on December 6th to direct then Director of National Intelligence James Clapper to conduct a comprehensive review of all available intelligence and provide the IC's best assessment of Russian activities related to the election. Remember, throughout this process, you have a number of people who work for the US government who are going to the media and telling the media stuff about what we assess from a highly classified point of view, what we think these foreign enemies of the United States are doing to us and what it means for the election. You had all this stuff from the FBI leaking out about Hillary Clinton's emails, mid-year exam, about Donald Trump's dealings with Russia. And a lot of these things were under the table, they were leaks, they were illegal, late in the election season, we have a rumor that turns out to be true that there's been a Pfizer warrant thrown on one of the Trump campaign's advisors. Remember, Pfizer warrants, their mere existence is highly classified. So when Heat Street and Louise Mensch reported on Carter Page's FISA, that was espionage. 18 U.S. Code 793. Same thing they just indicted John Bolton for. And should people have been indicted for it immediately? Absolutely. Was the posture of the Department of Justice such that we didn't prosecute espionage because it might have smacked of journalism? Yes. Is that completely a wreck, a mess to clean up? I think so. But then again, I'm the guy in 2010 and 13 when WikiLeaks was coming out and we were normalizing the idea of espionage as journalism. I was out there on Twitter with others arguing with Glenn Greenwald that no, espionage is not journalism. And here's what it led to. It led to spy agencies having competing roles with the media, talking about highly classified stuff. This stuff should never have happened and it should never happen again, so I'm glad we're looking at it. So Obama says, "Dear spooks, please clean up your messes. Go give me your best opinion on what happened with Trump and Russia." However, before work on the assessment even began, media leaks suggesting that the IC had already reached definitive conclusions and it risked creating an anchoring bias. Ooh, I love this. Anchoring bias is a specific type of cognitive bias that we look at in intelligence analysis. Anchoring bias is somebody comes along when a question has been asked to the analyst and says, "Here's what I think it is." And if that person's your boss, that's the anchor around which you may do your analysis that might not have anything to do with the intelligence that is before you. So here, this is good nerdy tradecraft stuff. There's a problem in how this was done by people leaking to the media that, oh yeah, there's a consensus in the intelligence community that risked creating an anchoring bias for everyone that might have known about it or might be writing in the days to follow. Good stuff to be concerned about. On December 9th, both the Washington Post and New York Times reported the IC had concluded with high confidence Russia had intervened specifically to help Trump. As we know, Obama just ordered everybody to have a meeting on the 9th to go do a final check on everything that's coming in. And we know from the ICA that was put out to the public a few days later that information was rolling in all the time. That's what they told us. And on the 9th of December, some jaboni is going to the Post and the New York Times and saying, oh, it's already done. Putin wanted Trump. So somebody was massaging a narrative top to bottom here. It's not good. Procedural concerns. The Director of Analysis review identified multiple procedural anomalies in the preparation of the ICA. These included a highly compressed production timeline, stringent compartmentation, and excessive involvement of agency heads. They get into these all individually as well. Timeline impact. The highly compressed timeline was atypical for a formal IC assessment, which ordinarily can take months to prepare, especially for assessments of such length and complexity and political sensitivity. CIA's primary authors, they're spilling the tea here, CIA's primary authors had less than a week to draft the assessment and less than 2 days to formally coordinate it with IC peers. Can we back up for a second and talk about the fact that this is Russia that still had a nuclear arsenal? If they really interfered in our democracy to this point where they're going to install an agent in the White House, that one of our options might be striking them with a nuclear missile onto Moscow. So the guys having to write this at CIA headquarters, they're like, oh my God, if we get this wrong, we might start a war. And they got what, 48 hours, 96 hours to do this when they're drafting it? That is not good, my friends. Less than a week to draft the assessment, less than 2 days to coordinate it with the other intelligence agencies before it went into its final review process, just as everyone's leaving Washington for Christmas break. This is the understatement of the decade. Multiple IC stakeholders felt jammed by the compressed timeline. I'll bet, I gotta get Timmy the latest Xbox game. I gotta not start a war with Russia that involves nukes, and I gotta go to the Maryland shore with my family. Oh my God. Here's where the CIA Tradecraft review addresses the elephant in the room here. Rushed timeline justified. ICD 203 stipulates that analysis be, quote, independent of political consideration and must not be distorted by nor shaped for advocacy of a particular audience, agenda, or policy viewpoint. The election had concluded, and the ICA was essentially a post-mortem analysis. Therefore, the rushed timeline to publish both classified and unclassified versions before the presidential transition raised questions about a potential political motive behind the White House tasking and timeline. I'll say they wanted this out ASAP so that the CIA could do this before Trump sat down and would have operational control over the CIA. Almost says that the CIA was not going to get along with the guy who would be using the CIA to protect the United States only a few weeks away. That's a really troubling conflict to resolve here as to why that wouldn't be a terrible precedent, setting up an awful tension between the White House and the Central Intelligence Agency. And of course, that appears to be what happened. Compartmentation challenges. This is who has access to which type of intelligence. Uneven access to highly compartmented information further complicated coordination and review and contributed to analytic differences on the ICA's most contentious point. In other words, not enough analysts got access to anything that really said Vladimir Putin preferred Trump. Central to the judgment that Putin, quote, aspired to help Trump win was one highly classified CIA report. Brennan had tightly restricted access to this information within CIA. It had been collected in July, but not disseminated in CIA serialized reporting until the week of December 19th, 2016. Question there, was that the Steele dossier? The CIA drafters had enjoyed privileged access to this information through participation in a highly compartmented analytic effort known as the Fusion Cell, which Brennan had created in July to focus on the IC's growing concern about Russian election interference. But the way they handled all this intel just looks really weird in retrospect. One CIA manager stated that uneven access to compartmented information among ICA coordinators and reviewers contributed to an already chaotic process. He said some key analysts and managers were not cleared to review the ICA's most controversial aspects and were only able to see portions of the draft out of context. And this makes no sense to me. These guys all have clearances. If Vladimir Putin really wanted Trump that bad, we got audio of him, we've got payments here and there. How do these guys with clearances not have permission to go look at it? Unless maybe it didn't quite exist, and that's what they didn't have permission to go look at. Maybe there was like 2 dudes who had access to the Steele dossier, and they're like, oh, it's super, super secret. You can't see all the terrible stuff we have on Trump and Putin because it's just so incredibly sensitive, which is almost exactly how they handle all the stuff around Iraq. Oh, Iraq, terrible weapons, amazing weapons. It's just, they're gonna hit Cleveland, they're gonna hit Tulsa. Oh, you're not cleared to see it. Here's another contradiction in terms. A report in 2017 indicated that the highest classified version of the ICA had been shared with more than 200 US officials. This is unusually high for such a highly compartmented product and calls into question whether the extreme limitations on access to underlying intelligence within the IC during the preparation was justifiable. In other words, we compartmented the hell out of the people writing the thing to see just why certain people at CIA thought that Putin wanted Trump, but then they distributed the report far and wide. If this was so sensitive, why didn't you let the people writing it have access to the supposed smoking guns about Trump and Putin? Unless all of this worked exactly like y'all made it work during the Iraq War run-up, which is interesting because Brennan and Clapper were involved in the run-up to Iraq on fake intelligence as well, so this is starting to look like a very terrible pattern. Speaking of agency heads, agency head involvement. While agency heads sometimes review controversial analytic assessments before publication, their direct engagement in the ICA's development was highly unusual in scope and intensity. To me, that says Brennan cooked this up with his buddy Clapper. I don't like putting these things in such a stark tone and manner, but this just looks like a few guys, just like in Iraq, a few guys lied us into a war that lasted 20 years. Guys, the point is, we could go all day with this. There's 8 pages to the Tradecraft review. It says that key agencies were cut out without explanation, like State Department, INR, and the Defense Intelligence Agency. It says that the Steele dossier was officially jammed in, and they said we didn't really use it to reach our conclusions, but they did. That's a lie as well. On and on it goes. Either way, the intelligence agencies, through the Director of National Intelligence, Jim Clapper, decided to get involved with the American political discussion in a way that is completely inappropriate. And on top of it, you got this Brennan guy who took control of the analytic and drafting process and jammed this thing through to be able to sit in front of Congress before Trump sat down. And most importantly, the conclusions that they reached were dog shit that were supported basically by no intelligence, with the same trust us, it's classified, that they used to lie us into the Iraq War, killing countless innocent people. This is a terrible thing, and it seems rather criminal, and as a result, especially since Brennan lied about it under oath, he may go to prison over it. So might Jim Clapper. So might a bunch of other people. And no matter what you think about Trump, and there was a bunch going on between Trump and Russia in this time period. He had Paul Manafort as a campaign manager. His people were meeting with the Russians in April of 2016 at the Mayflower Hotel. He did buy a house from the Russians and made $50 million off the top in a really dodgy way. All of those were reasonable questions, like after he fires Jim Comey and invites the Russians on over. All of that led to serious questions, but that's very different than the intelligence community coming out and telling us, hey, we've got secret intelligence that says this guy really works for Vladimir Putin and it's terrible. So maybe there's going to be criminal prosecutions. I can't wait to learn more. Hit like, hit subscribe, and I will see you in the comments. Thanks for spending this time with me.